Lecture 4 is going to cover the endocrine system, which is going to be chapter 16. And this is going to be the final chapter that's included in your midterm. So your midterm is going to cover chapter 1, 2, 3, 23, and 16. The endocrine system is one of the body's main control systems. So along with the nervous system, the endocrine system uh, uses hormones to influence metabolic activities, and it's involved in reproduction, growth, development, the maintenance of electrolytes, water, nutrient balance, regulation of metabolism, energy balance, and also the body's defenses. The endocrine glands, so the organs of the endocrine system, include the pituitary, the thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, and the pineal glands. The hypothalamus is considered to be a neuroendocrine organ because it's involved in the nervous system and also the endocrine system. And that's because it receives electrical signals from the brain and it translates those signals into chemical signals that are used by the endocrine system. Some of these glands have either exocrine or endocrine functions, like the pancreas, gonads, and the placenta. So the exocrine glands are the glands that have ducts. Endocrine glands are considered to be ductless glands. So these are glands without ducts. The pancreas, gonads, and placenta, they have the duct. Other organs that produce hormones are or tissues include adipose cells, the thymus, and also cells in the walls of the small intestine, the stomach, uh, kidneys, and the heart. So here you can see the location of these endocrine organs. The hypothalamus is the most superior of all of them. So it's located superior to all of the rest of the organs. Inferior to the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. So this little tiny gland here. It does have two parts to it. There's an anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Okay. Below that, there's a thyroid gland, this butterfly-shaped organ here. There's a thymus, the two adrenal glands that are located on top of the kidneys, pancreas, and then we have the gonads. So the one that we're not going to talk about in this lecture is going to be the thymus, but we are going to address the hormones that the other glands secrete. So for this lecture, you do have to know the different glands, which are already listed here for you. Okay, the thyroid gland, pineal, etc. And you do have to know the hormone that they produce. So for example, thyroid gland secretes the thyroid hormone, pineal gland secretes melatonin, and you have to know the response of the hormone. So in the case of melatonin, that regulates the sleep-wake cycles. For the thyroid hormone, that's involved in metabolism. The pituitary gland has 8 different hormones, 6 of them from the anterior pituitary, and 2 are from the posterior pituitary. I am going to go over those later on. So you do also have to know the hormones for those and the response that each of those hormones has. For pancreas, there's insulin and glucagon. These are involved in increasing or decreasing blood glucose. Okay. There's the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland has 2 different regions, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. These specific hormones come from the adrenal cortex, which is the outer part of the adrenal gland. So there's the mineralocorticoids and the glucocorticoids. And these are involved in ion balance and glucose metabolism. Then there's adipose, which has leptin, which is involved in lipid metabolism. And then there's the heart, which secretes the atrionatriuretic peptide, which is involved in decreasing blood pressure. Okay, so again, you do have to know the gland these glands that I listed, the hormone, and the response that they have. So hormones are long distance chemical signals that travel in the blood or lymph. Lymph is the fluid that's found in the lymphatic system. So these are other vessels that are closely associated with the blood, with the cardiovascular system, but it's a separate system. Okay. That plays a, a major role in the immune system. But that's what that is, lymph. There's two main classes of hormones. There's the amino acid based hormones, which are amino acid derivatives. So they're made from amino acids. They're peptides and proteins. So examples of these would be like melatonin and catecholamines. Catecholamines include epinephrine and norepinephrine. These types of hormones are water soluble hormones, and because they are water soluble, they do have to attach to the cell membrane. So they cannot cross the cell membrane, they have to attach to the surface of the cell membrane. Then there's the steroid hormones, which are synthesized from cholesterol. These include gonadal and the adrenocortical hormones. And the steroid hormones, these are lipid soluble, so these can cross the cell membrane. Okay, so the hormones do circulate systematically, but only the cells with receptors for that hormone are going to be affected. So these are called target cells. So this includes tissues with receptors for a specific hormone. So even if a receptor is exposed to different hormones, it won't attach to them because it doesn't have uh, the right shape to it. So it's like a lock and key uh, relationship. So the target cells have specific uh, receptors that bind to specific hormones. The hormone's action on the cells could include altering the plasma membrane permeability or the membrane potential by opening and closing ion channels. It could stimulate synthesis of enzymes or other proteins. So remember, synthesis is to build. It's either put together enzymes or proteins. It can either activate or deactivate enzymes, or it can induce secretory activity. And then finally, it could also stimulate mitosis. Amino acid based hormones, with the exception of the thyroid hormones, exert effects through second messenger systems. So this is what we're going to go over. But we're only going to address the cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP, so the AMP stands for adenosine monophosphate. The other one is the PIP2 calcium messenger system. We're not going to address that one. Okay, but the PIP2, that stands for the phosphatidyl inositol biphosphate calcium. Okay. For the cyclic AMP signaling mechanism, that starts with a hormone, which is considered to be the first messenger, and that's going to bind to a receptor. And then the receptor is going to activate a specific protein called the G protein. And that G protein is going to activate or inhibit the effector, which is going to be an enzyme called adenylate cyclase. The adenylate cyclase is then going to convert the ATP to cyclic AMP. So it's going to go from adenosine triphosphate to cyclic adenosine monophosphate. Okay? And that's going to be the second messenger. Cyclic AMP is going to then activate a protein kinase, and that is going to phosphorylate, meaning it's going to add a phosphate to other proteins. Then the phosphorylated proteins are going to be either activated or inactivated, and the cyclic AMP is going to degrade the enzyme phosphodiesterase, and it's going to stop the reaction. Okay. So here's the model for the cyclic AMP second messenger mechanism of water-soluble hormones. So if we start here with the first messenger, okay, which is going to be the hormone binding to the receptor, that's going to then activate the G protein. So when the G protein is considered active, uh, it's going to swap the GDP for GTP. So once it does that, it's considered active. Then the receptor um, or the G protein is going to activate the adenylate cyclase. So this G protein is going to go over here. It's going to bind to the adenylate cyclase, which is the enzyme, and it's going to activate it. From here, the adenylate cyclase is going to convert the ATP to cyclic AMP. So it'll go from adenosine triphosphate to cyclic adenosine monophosphate. And then the cyclic AMP is going to activate the protein kinases. Okay. So once the protein kinase is active, this is going to trigger the response of the target cell. So it's either going to, activate an enzyme, it's going to stimulate cellular secretion, or it's going to open an ion channel. So target cells, they have to have specific receptors for a hormone to bind. So for example, the adrenocorticotropic hormone receptors are found only in the cells of the adrenal cortex. But the thyroxine receptors are found in nearly all the cells in the body. The target cell activation depends on three factors. So it can either be the blood levels of hormone, the number of receptors in the target cell, or the affinity between the receptor and the hormone. How long the hormone stays in the body depends on different things because it can be removed from the blood by either an enzyme or by organs like the kidneys or the liver. The half-life of a hormone, this is the time that's required for the hormone in the blood to decrease by half. Okay. This varies, there's a range in time, so it could be less than a minute or it could be a week that the hormone lasts. It it varies depending on the hormone. Multiple hormones can act on the same target at the same time. So permissiveness, this is when one hormone cannot exert its effect without the presence of another hormone. So for example, uh, the reproductive hormones, they need the thyroid hormone. Synergism is when more than one hormone produces the same effects on a target cell, causing amplification. An example for that would be like glucagon and epinephrine. So epinephrine, I mentioned it earlier, is one of the catecholamines. But both the glucagon and epinephrine, they both cause the liver to release glucose. So that's an example of synergism. Antagonism, that's when more hormones, that's when one or more hormones oppose the action of another hormone. So an example for this is insulin and glucagon, because insulin is there to decrease blood sugar levels, glucagon is there to increase blood sugar levels. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland through a stalk that's called the infundibulum. And the pituitary gland, like I mentioned earlier, there's an anterior pituitary lobe and a posterior pituitary lobe. And together these secrete 8 major hormones. Oops. So here's just to show you the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. You don't have to know this whole mechanism or this process, just understand the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So know that the hypothalamus is the one that's receiving those electrical signals from the brain, and it's translating those signals into chemical signals that it sends to the pituitary gland. And the posterior pituitary gland, that's where you're going to find oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So these two hormones are not made in the posterior pituitary, but they're stored. They're stored in the posterior pituitary. They're made in the hypothalamus. Okay. But like I mentioned, you do have to know the target tissue and the response for each of these hormones. So for the oxytocin, you do have to know that the target tissues would be things like the uterus and the and breast, because in the uterus it stimulates uterine contractions. So that would be the response. For breast, it stimulates or initiates milk ejection. Okay, so not milk production, but milk ejection. The antidiuretic hormone, the target tissue would be the kidneys, and this one stimulates the kidney uh, to reabsorb water. For the anterior pituitary hormones, you do have to know these six hormones. And for all of these hormones, I did provide the letter that stands for the hormones, like growth hormone, GH, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. But for you, you do have to know the complete name, okay? Not just the letters that stand for the hormone. You have to memorize the complete name. So starting with the growth hormone, the main target for this hormone would be the liver, skeletal muscle, and bone, and it stimulates the somatic growth in those tissues. Okay. It also mobilizes fat, and it spares glucose. The thyroid stimulating hormone, the target tissue would be the thyroid gland, and this stimulates the gland to release thyroid hormone. Okay, so thyroid hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone are not the same thing. This hormone stimulates the release of thyroid hormone. Okay. And then there's the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is going to target the adrenal cortex. So recall that the adrenal cortex is the outer layer of the adrenal gland, and that's going to promote the release of glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. The follicle stimulating hormone, that's going to target the ovaries and the testes. So in the ovaries, it's going to stimulate the ovarian follicles to mature, and it's also going to be involved in the production of estrogen. In the testes, it's going to be involved in sperm production. Then there's the luteinizing hormone. That's also going to target the ovaries and the testes. In the ovaries, it's going to trigger ovulation. It's also going to stimulate the production of estrogen. And in males, it's going to stimulate the production of testosterone. For prolactin, that the target tissue would be uh, the breast secretory tissue, and that's going to promote lactation, so the production of milk. Okay. Oxytocin, that was involved in milk ejection. This one is involved in milk production. So when you do have a homeostatic imbalance of these hormones, so that has consequences. So for example, for the growth hormone, right, this is the one that's secreted by the anterior pituitary. If there's an issue in the anterior pituitary, like due to a tumor, this could lead to imbalances. So in children, this results in gigantism if you have a hypersecretion of growth hormone. Okay. And in adults, that leads to acromegaly. So that's when an adult has a, you know, large, large feet, large hands, and also a large face. Hyposecretion of growth hormone, that affects children. It doesn't affect an adult. So if you're an adult and you have hyposecretion of growth hormone, at that point it wouldn't affect you. But for children, it does result in pituitary dwarfism. For the thyroid hormone, if you have hyposecretion or low secretion of thyroid hormone, this could lead to myxedema. So the symptoms include a low metabolic rate. That's the main thing because remember the thyroid hormone is involved in regulating your metabolism. It could cause puffy eyes, uh, an edema, mental sluggishness, lethargy. If it's due to a lack of iodine, that could develop a goiter because iodine is needed. Um, the thyroid gland needs the iodine to produce thyroid hormone. So with the lack of iodine, that decreases the thyroid hormone levels. This is going to trigger an increase in thyroid stimulating hormone. So thyroid stimulating hormone, again, is different than thyroid hormone. When the thyroid stimulating hormone is increased, that's going to trigger the thyroid to synthesize more unusable uh, thyroglobulin, and that's going to cause the thyroid to enlarge. Hypersecretion of thyroid hormone. This leads to a disease that's known as Graves' disease. So this is an autoimmune disease that makes the body make an abnormal amount of antibodies that attack the thyroid cells. These antibodies, they'll mimic the thyroid stimulating hormone, and this is going to lead to more thyroid hormone release. Symptoms, this is going to include elevated metabolic rate, sweating, rapid and irregular heartbeats, nervousness, and weight loss. It could also result in eyes protruding because the tissue behind the eyes becomes edematous and fibrous. So edematous meaning there's a fluid accumulation behind the eyes. For the adrenal gland, when under stress, like these, for example, this is going to be considered a short-term stress, like when you're fleeing from a dangerous situation. What happens is your hypothalamus sends an electrical signal to the spinal cord through axons, and from the spinal cord, that signal is going to be relayed to the medullary region of the adrenal gland. When that signal reaches that area of the adrenal gland or the adrenal medulla, it's going to cause it to release the epinephrine and norepinephrine hormones. And this is going to reinforce other sympathetic responses. And it's going to get the body ready for a fight or flight response. So it's going to cause the heart to increase the heart rate. So blood pressure is also going to go up. The respiratory effects would be the bronchioles are going to dilate so that more airflow could travel through the passages. And that's also obviously going to help oxygenate the blood. For metabolic effects, there's going to be an increase in blood glucose levels because the liver is going to convert glycogen to glucose, and so that the body can have more energy available for use. Long-term stress, that's also starts here at the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to send that signal to the anterior pituitary, okay, because it's going to cause the hypothalamus to release the corticotropin releasing hormone, and that hormone is going to cause the release of the adrenal corticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary. Okay. From there, the anterior pituitary, so it releases that hormone, the adrenal corticotropic hormone, and that's going to go to the adrenal gland. So just like this flow chart shows you. Starting with the hypothalamus, we have the corticotropin releasing hormone that goes to the anterior pituitary. That causes the anterior pituitary to release the adrenal corticotropic hormone, and that targets the adrenal gland. Then the adrenal gland, at the adrenal cortex, the outer region of the adrenal gland, it's going to synthesize and release the glucocorticoids like cortisol and also some mineralocorticoids like aldosterone. The mineralocorticoids, those are going to affect the kidneys because it's going to cause the kidneys to retain sodium. And because water follows sodium, it's going to increase the blood volume and also increase blood pressure. For metabolic effects that increases the the amino acids in the blood. It increases the blood glucose levels, causes uh, the breakdown of fat, but that comes at the cost of suppressing the immune system. Okay. So long-term stressors, like when you're going over long periods of time without food, like starvation, the response is uh, it could become very serious because it could lead to high blood pressure, it could lead to muscle loss, it could lead to a compromised immune system, and other various problems. Okay, so this is just to recap where all these organs are. So remember the pineal gland is also up here in the brain. There's the hypothalamus. Right underneath the hypothalamus, there's the pituitary gland. You have the thyroid gland in the neck area. We didn't cover the thymus. The two adrenal glands are on top of the kidneys, and then the gonads. So I do want you to know this mechanism for the regulation of blood glucose levels. So this is going to be the other question that I want you to be able to describe on the exam. Okay, I want you to describe what happens when blood glucose goes up. So, and also what happens when blood glucose goes down. If you have a stimulus that increases blood glucose levels, that's going to cause the pancreas to secrete insulin. Insulin is going to stimulate the liver to take in glucose and store it as glycogen. And also it's going to stimulate the tissue cells to take in glucose. So when that happens, the glucose in the blood is going to drop, and that's going to bring the blood glucose levels back to normal. If you go over a period of time without eating, or a long time without eating, then the blood sugar levels go down. That's going to cause the pancreas to secrete glucagon. So that's the other hormone. Okay? Glucagon does the opposite of insulin. Glucagon is going to stimulate the glycogen breakdown. So it's going to stimulate the liver to convert glycogen to glucose. Okay? And then when the liver does that, it's going to release the glucose into the bloodstream. And that's going to bring the blood sugar levels back up. Okay, so I do want you to know uh, this mechanism, okay, how the pancreas regulates the blood glucose levels. And speaking of blood glucose levels, there's a disease that's called diabetes mellitus, which can be caused by two separate, for two reasons that involve insulin. If there's hyposecretion of insulin, that's referred to as or classified as type 1 diabetes. That means that your body or your pancreas is not secreting enough insulin or isn't secreting insulin at all. Then there's hypoactivity of insulin, which is classified as type 2 diabetes. That's when your body or your pancreas does produce the insulin, but the cells that are supposed to recognize the insulin are desensitized. So they no longer recognize the presence of insulin. The three main signs of diabetes mellitus is a huge urine output, which could cause glucose to act as an osmotic diuretic. Because when you have a high levels of glucose in the blood, your liver, or not the liver, the kidneys aren't able to filter all that sugar out of the urine. Okay? And when it doesn't do that, that means that a lot of sugar is going out with the urine. And when that happens, the water is going to be drawn into the urine. So it's drawn into the urine and it leaves your body. So it causes you to lose a lot of water. There's also polydipsia, which means excessive thirst. Okay, that's related to the first one because if you're losing a lot of water, you're gonna be thirsty. And there's polyphagia. That means that you have an excessive hunger or food consumption. This is because the cells can't take up the glucose, and so they give you that sensation of that you're starving. When sugars can't be used as fuel, then the fats are used instead. So this causes lipidemia, which is result in high levels of fatty acids in the blood. So fatty acid metabolism results in the formation of ketones or ketone bodies. Ketones are acidic, and when they build up in the blood, they can cause ketoacidosis. And if untreated, ketoacidosis causes hyperpnea, which is a elevated breathing, disrupted heart activity, and oxygen transport. And also, it could lead to severe depression of the nervous system that could lead to death. Okay, so that's going to do it for chapter 16. And again, the second long response that I want you to know is the how the pancreas regulates blood glucose levels. So I want you to know how it brings it down and how it brings it up. But obviously, I do want you to include all the details. Okay, so be specific.